Hey, I'm Tamara Kandaker, and you're listening to The Decibel from the Globe and Mail. It's August 27th near the Kabul airport, and just the day before, Canada stopped evacuating people out of Afghanistan. This scene is playing out in video footage from a GoPro camera. Ukrainian soldiers are patrolling the dusty grounds outside the airport where, not even 24 hours earlier, 160 Afghans and 13 U.S. service members were killed by a suicide bomber. One of the soldiers points in the direction of a crowd of people standing behind the concertina wire on the ground. And just above them, barely visible, you can see the tops of two minibuses that are driving up.
We need these two buses, the right side. Yeah, we saw them. Just a second. We need to go through the wire, and to enter the airport, we have a connection there.
The crowd stuck behind the barbed wire starts yelling at the soldiers as one of them says,
Get them back.
They start approaching the crowd, trying to get them to move, firing their guns into the air. People start crouching down on the ground. The soldiers keep moving ahead, and the people get up. Many of them are clutching documents, a few are holding children, and they start to walk backwards as the soldiers approach, shying away as the shots continue.
Get back!
A white and blue minibus pulls up. A young man from the crowd walks up to the bus and tries hanging on to the side doors. He seems to realize the bus is going into the airport, and he also wants a ride, but he gets pushed off.
Go away! Get away!
A second minibus pulls up. This one's yellow, and crowds start filling up the space behind it on the road. Suddenly, you hear screams, and panic sets in. People are running, furiously trying to get away from the street. Passengers are pouring out of the bus and scrambling when they hit the ground. The Ukrainian soldiers start sprinting too, to get back behind the wire so that they can take cover behind a shipping container. It's not totally clear what the source of the panic is, but then you hear gunshots, further away, being fired by the Taliban. But thanks to the escort from the soldiers, the buses have made it in, and they're safely on the airport grounds. The soldiers then check with the driver to make sure the passengers are the same ones that they've been expecting.
United Nations? Yeah? Who is in the second bus?
In the second bus are the families of Afghan nationals who are desperate to leave the country. One of them is Mohammed, Sharaf. Now, just over 2 weeks later, Sharif and his family are safely in Canada.
This is the first time, long journey.
Well, it's your first time in Canada.
Yeah, first time in Canada. First time, but it would be my second home.
Yeah, it will be your home.
Yeah, my home.
Your home.
Sharif was a fixer for the Globe during Canada's mission in Afghanistan, helping our reporters with everything from translating to evading Taliban attacks. MacKinnon was one of those reporters. He's also been working behind the scenes for weeks to help Sharif and other fixers who worked with the Globe get out of the country. So how was it that Ukrainian soldiers ended up rescuing Sharif and his family? Mark is on the show to tell us the story. That's today on The Decibel. Hi, Mark. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
There are a number of people in this story, and I want to start by getting people acquainted with them. First of all, can you tell me briefly who Sharaf and Mukhtar Amiri are, and how do you know them?
Well, Sharaf was someone I met on my very first trip into Afghanistan in 2002, which was back right at the start of the Canadian military mission to Kandahar. And Sharif was someone who, on that first trip in, when I knew absolutely nothing about the region that I had suddenly been dispatched into, he wasn't actually my formal translator on that trip, but he was sort of assisting my translator because Sharif was introduced as one of the smartest guys in Kandahar. He was the director of a local school before the war, and he sort of had connections across all the tribal lines and across, from both sides of the Taliban and those fighting the Taliban. He just knew everybody. And so he became the word as a fixer for not just for myself, but for a long list of Globe correspondents who went to Kandahar to cover the war. Mukhtar Amiri was, actually I've never met him, and I look forward to meeting him at some point in this ordeal now that he's somewhere safe. Mukhtar was hired in 2011 by my colleague Susan Sachs, who set up a Kabul bureau to cover the last year of sort of Canadian military presence in Afghanistan. And as Susan describes it, Mukhtar did everything for the bureau. He was the driver, he was the translator, he was the fixer, again, to use that word, and sort of the person she relied on for safety and for knowledge about the country that she was reporting from.
And a lot of people probably don't understand the role of fixers and what journalists do, what foreign correspondents do. And I'm wondering if you could maybe shed some light on that. Like, how do you think Mukhtar and Sharif's work helped our understanding of the war in Afghanistan?
In this term fixer, some people say translator, interpreter, the different words for it. A fixer, though, implies something more than just translating the language. There's someone who they're your guide to the country that you're covering, and sometimes one that you've just arrived in. And both of them, I think, without their work, the Globe and Mail would have struggled to produce some of the projects that it did. Most notably, Sharif was instrumental in a project he did with our correspondent Graham Smith that's called Talking to the Taliban, where they went and the Globe won an Emmy for this, where they went and spoke with a collection of Taliban fighters to get their point of view and to understand why they were still fighting against the NATO presence in their country, which was otherwise being portrayed in the Western media generally as a positive thing for Afghanistan. We had to understand their side of things, and we got that through Sharif. And similarly with the project that Jessica Leader, another Globe correspondent, did called Behind the Veil, meeting Afghanistan's women and getting their voices out. So we've heard from Canadian military that, Sharif's reporting helped them understand the country that they were in as well as our readers back home.
So when did you first hear from Sharif that he wanted help getting out of the country?
So there's a lot of twists of fate in this story. And the first one, from my perspective, is that after not having myself been to Afghanistan for 18 years, my editors asked me a few months ago, would you go back to Afghanistan for the September 11th anniversary? And I said, absolutely. I'd be fascinated to see what has and hasn't changed since I was there last. And so I reached out immediately to Sharif and I said, hey, I'm coming to Kabul, maybe to Kandahar, can you work with me? And he kind of wrote back within minutes, saying, anything you need, brother. And so we were having this conversation about, when I would arrive. I've got the visa now. I'm thinking about this date for arrival. Does that work for you? Should I come by the airport or by the land border? And then suddenly everything gets turned on its head and the Taliban are taking first cities in the countryside. The situation's getting dangerous. And then they capture Kabul on August 15th. And so that day, I messaged to Sharif and to another translator that I was in contact with and say, are you safe or should I try and get you out? And Sharif said, please, help me out of here. I don't feel safe with the Taliban back in power. And so from that moment on, we spent the next few weeks trying to do everything we could to get Sharif somewhere. And eventually Mukhtar, when I got in contact with him, I made the same offer. And he said he wanted out as well. The third translator, the gentleman that took me through in a carpet back in the day, decided to stay in Afghanistan and, as he says, keep building his country.
So you were working quietly behind the scenes for weeks to get these men out. And tell me about the different avenues that you tried.
Well, we were really trying everything because we didn't know what would work or if anything would work. So started out by, going to the Canadian government. I had personal appeals to Minister Marco Mendicino in the Immigration Department and to Chrystia Freeland, the Deputy Prime Minister, both of whom I knew outside of journalism a little bit, and to pressure them, to ask them to get us the paperwork we needed to move Mukhtar and Sharif if and when an opening occurred. Separately, I was in contact with, I'd spent a lot of time in Qatar in the last few years, so I had some good contacts in the foreign ministry there, and I was asking them, because they had a special relationship with the Taliban, just to, if you're able to move people to the airport, in a convoy and get them to Doha, can you please have our names on your list? And then there were all these longer shot requests where I was asking the French government, the American government. There were opportunities with the Turks and to Uganda at various points in time, but finally to the Ukrainian government, just saying, if you can fly anybody out, please put our people on this list.
And what kind of response did you get from the cabinet ministers? What did they say when you called on them to help?
I mean, everybody was very willing to help. Everybody understood the gravity of the situation. But the wheels of Canadian bureaucracy, even with high-powered political support, if they say yes from the minister's office that they want to help this happen, it was taking days. And meanwhile, the situation on the ground in Kabul was changing by the hour. So everybody was, had some good intentions everywhere, but it was too slow in Ottawa, and things were moving too fast in Kabul.
So there were a number of rescue attempts that fell through, and your accounts of them are pretty harrowing. Can you tell me about some of those and why they didn't work out?
Well, the first couple of attempts that we were really hopeful about were actually organized by the Canadian military, and both of them involved Mukhtar and Sharif and their families getting to a very specific point near the airport. And one of them, there's like a circled sort of spot on the airport fence where they were supposed to sort of get there and then get pulled through the fence by a soldier who would be waiting for them. And these were, they weren't sent as sort of map points or Google map points in a way that, sort of younger people these days might be willing to follow. There was someone had printed off a map and drawn a circle with a pen. And we could never quite figure out, even, me in London, I couldn't figure out exactly where we were trying to go. And plus there was just this crowd of thousands and thousands of Afghans desperate to leave the country surrounding the airport. And they're trying to push through, but you're traveling with your family. In the case of Mukhtar, it's his wife, 6 kids, and he's pushing his 92-year-old grandmother in a cart. Mm-hmm. And it's just, you couldn't get through the crowds, let alone find the point. Same for Sharif. The 2 Canadian rescues were both well-intentioned, but just all the risk was on the Afghans to get to these rescue points.
Yeah. And I know even hours before the Ukraine rescue mission, it looked like Mukhtar and Sharif wouldn't get out. And you got this phone call from a woman from the U.S. State Department. And can you tell me about that call?
Yeah, that was one of the lowest moments of this entire process, because we'd gone through this effort of a couple of times trying to get them to meet these Canadian pickups that I described near the Baron Hotel or on the outskirts of the airport, and failing to reach these pickup points.
Hi, brother. Sorry for disturbing you. We are just going to be escorted by Qataris, as I confirm it, and you know better. So should we leave and go to Baron Hotel for now, or what do you think? So what is your instruction? If you tell me, we will follow that. Should we
never had quite the right paperwork to make that all go. And then the U.S. State Department, with a State Department liaison, because there was a request from U.S. Congress people to evacuate a list of translators, and we got Mukhtar and Sharif onto this list. And so they're out in the middle of the night, like it's early morning Kabul time, and they're in a convoy of 10 to 15 cars sitting by the side of the road waiting for an expected collection from the U.S. military. And then this woman calls me up and just says, I'm sorry, the troops aren't coming. They can't leave the base because of the suicide attack that had occurred a few hours previously. The gates were going to be welded shut, and nobody except for, U.S. and other Western country nationals were going to be evacuated any further. And she was just, I couldn't see her, but it sounded like she was crying. And she said, just tell your people to do whatever they can, whatever's best for them and their families. And then I had to call them and relay this message that it felt like I was saying you're on your own.
Yeah.
And thankfully things took a turn for the better after that.
Here's another podcast you might be interested in, The Big Story. Canadians might not have wanted a federal election, but that's what we've got. Every day, you're being inundated with platforms and partisanship, scandals and promises, and enough media noise to drown out anything truly meaningful. How do you sift through all the junk to get to what really matters to you? The answer is Canada Votes, a special series of the Big Story podcast. Join host Jordan Heath Rawlings on the Big Story from now until Election Day as he talks to the experts to get the crucial information we need to make your vote matter. What's actually in the platforms? What has the Liberal government actually done? Which of the hundreds of promises are realistic and which are just a ploy to buy your vote? The Big Story covers all of it. Listen to Canada Votes, a special campaign series of The Big Story on the Frequency Podcast Network or wherever you get your podcasts. So how did Ukraine ultimately get involved in this?
We were casting lines in every direction we could. And as part of this process, I'd mentioned a couple of times on Twitter that I was working to get Globe and Mail translators out of Afghanistan. And so Roman Waschuk, who is a former Canadian ambassador to Ukraine, said, the Ukrainians have a plane there and they're evacuating people. And he suggested I get in contact with a man named Andriy Bukvich, who is in the office of President Volodymyr Zelensky in Kyiv. So I called Andriy up and I said, is this true? Do you think you can get our guys on a list? And he said, yeah, send us the names and we'll do what we can. And to be honest, though, I'd sent the names off to, as I said, half a dozen countries, and they all said they do what they can. So I wasn't betting on Ukraine, to be frank. And then in the middle of this night, where Sharif and Mukhtar and Jawed, a Canadian military translator that we sort of collected along the way, are sitting, in this convoy that doesn't get collected. Sharif gets a message from the Ukrainian military intelligence, I learned later, saying, be at the gate of this hotel and a specific hotel at 6 a.m. And, from there, everybody was saying, Mark, everybody's so tired right now. I can't ask my family to go through any more than they already have in the last few days. Mm-hmm. And so a series of decisions get made. Everybody kind of goes to bed except for Sharif, who decides to stick it out for the night. And thank God he did, because the Ukrainians do come in the morning and the rescue happens.
But Mukhtar decided to stay behind, right? I know he eventually found a way out, but tell me about that decision.
So, yes, as we were having this conversation, as it was becoming real to me, after I discuss, I get the phone number of the person who contacted Sharif, and I call them directly and I say, what's happening, and I get a sense of the plan and the fact that the Ukrainians, unlike any of the other rescue operations we've been talking about, we're going to leave Kabul airport and go collect our people and some others. So I communicate this to Sharif that, this is real. Please stay awake. Please, get your family and Jawed ready. And then I call to Mukhtar and I say, I think this might be the best way out right now. Obviously, I can't promise anything, but this sounds more promising than anything we've heard of for days. And because he'd been up for days and days pushing his poor grandmother around, I remember he wrote back, it was, sorry, man, I have some responsibility. And he just said, I can't do this to my family. My grandmother's really sick. And he sends me a photograph, which is sort of seared in my brain. And it says, during the melee outside the Kabul airport a couple of days previously, he got separated from his grandmother and his kids, and he was trying to sort of get to the front and get the attention of a soldier and say, "Listen, I've been, here talk to Mark MacKinnon on the telephone," and it was a gamble, but he got separated. When he got back to his family, she had this deep gash in her leg, and I didn't really understand, when he said, "Oh, my grandmother's a cut on her leg," I didn't understand, what that meant in terms of gravity, and I didn't really, cuts to the leg didn't sound like the biggest thing we had to worry about. It was the photograph he sent me that night was just a deep gash, and it's like almost purple and gray, and you can see that this is life-threatening potentially to a 93-year-old as she turned 93 that night. And this is very, very difficult. So at this point, Mukhtar is, he's got a wife and 6 kids under the age of 10 that were, in my mind, he maybe should have been prioritizing, but he just couldn't leave his grandmother behind. Even there's other relatives in the city, and he eventually does turn to them. In that moment, he just couldn't conceive of leaving her in the state she was in. Obviously, very difficult decision, and but he made the one that he thought was the right one at the time.
So I think the question a lot of people will have after hearing the story of the rescue is, why couldn't Canadian soldiers do what the Ukrainian soldiers ultimately did? Like, why couldn't they go beyond the fence and just bring these people in? And what do you think about that?
It's a very complicated question, a very charged question. When I speak with Jawed about it, I know he was, as someone who served alongside the Canadian military in Kandahar in special forces operations, he knows how brave and tough Canadian troops can be. And he says, he described to me how they did, we did things the Americans were not willing to try doing. And so he felt quite sort of almost a bit abandoned by the fact that no one was coming for him, despite the fact everybody knew where he was. And then the Ukrainians come out and they do this mission where they actually leave the base, collect the buses, run alongside them back in. If you watch the video, there's gunfire, Taliban fire crackling in the distance. I asked the Ukrainian Special Forces troops, I met them in Kyiv last week, and I said, so, what do you guys think about that? And they said it was down to the orders that you had. And he said the Canadian and American soldiers on the base had a mission that was very limited. It was to defend the evacuation, to defend the airfield, get the planes out, collect people who could get to them, but they did not have a mission to go into the city and rescue people. And the Ukrainians had a specific mission to go into the city and collect civilians and bring them in. Mm-hmm. And so the soldiers are saying, don't blame the soldiers, that blame their orders. We accomplish our mission, they accomplish their mission.
You point out a few instances in your piece where you were put in kind of an awkward position as a journalist because you're advocating on behalf of these families and you're calling in personal favors. And I wonder, how did this whole experience make you think about what a journalist's role is in situations like this?
I guess I stopped behaving like a journalist for a lot of it. I mean, I had editors asking me for stories for days and days, and I just, was putting it off and focusing or play my small role. I mean, let's not overstate this. These are Ukrainian troops who took the risks, and there are others who took risks. I just made a lot of phone calls and sent a lot of emails and stayed up late and watched little blue dots on my phone. For this point, I was just trying to think of if the situation were reversed. If I had gone into Afghanistan and the situation had turned poorly, it would have been Sharif, first of all, that I would hope would find a way to get me out. And so this was very much about sort of squaring up a debt that I had to him personally for when he helped me back in 2002. But also just, if I expected that of him, he had the right to expect that of me.
So Sharif is now in Canada, Jawad is still in Kiev, and you spent a lot of time with them and their families there. And you write in your story that you didn't realize how hard this next chapter probably would be for them. And tell me why. What do you think is next for these families?
Taking 19 people from Kandahar and plunking them down into the capital of Ukraine was a fascinating experience. I mean, there probably are not two places that are more different culturally than Kiev and Kandahar. And so in some ways, hopefully, I think that sort of cold water plunge that they went through in Ukraine will help them with Canada. Because Canada is a place where they are going to see a lot more. There are a lot of Afghans, certainly a lot of Muslim people in Canada. They will feel more comfortable. They'll be able to, there'll be communities that they can be integrated into that will help them make choices along the way. That said, I mean, it's a long way from Kandahar to Toronto, and Sharif's children are aged 12 to 22, and none of them, I think, are immediately ready to jump into the workforce. All of them are going to need to do some training, some retraining. His younger sons, they'll be starting high school at a significant disadvantage because they've learned everything, at a high school in Pashto language. Yeah, it's just going to be an enormous battle, and I think. And that's true also to a lesser extent of Jawad's family and Mukhtar's family. And I think the Globe, all of us that were working on this, were thinking of getting them out, getting them to safety. And only now is it starting dawning on us that there are a lot of challenges that still lie ahead as well.
So this has all happened around the 20th anniversary of 9/11. And you, of course, were there at the beginning of that war. And looking back now, 20 years later, what do you think the legacy of the war has been?
It's hard not to feel, as we're sort of evacuating the people who helped us and in the country back under Taliban control, and women in particular left to face an incredibly difficult future, that it was all for naught. I mean, we're talking about a war that killed thousands, 165 Canadians alone, and one that shaped a generation of people in Afghanistan as well, and we're right back where we started, and that is incredibly sad to think about.
Okay, Mark, thank you so much. It was a very moving story, so thank you for writing it, and thanks so much for all your work on this.
Thank you for having me on.
That's it for today. I'm Tamara Kandakar. Our producers are Madeline White and Kasia Mihailovich. David Crosby edits the show. Angela Pacenza is our executive editor. Thank you so much to Mark MacKinnon. You can follow him on Twitter at Mark MacKinnon. And a special thanks to Patrick Dell and Melissa Tate for their help with this episode. Before I let you go, just a quick note that we have a free webcast event at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time on September 14th called Back to Life, What Will Normal Look Like as Society Reopens. It's hosted by Kelly Grant, our national health reporter, and it'll feature experts from Ottawa Public Health. They'll be talking about what to expect when it comes to health, safety, and societal norms as Canadians start to gather in larger numbers this fall. If you want to email us, you can reach us at thedecibel@globeandmail.com. If you want to reach me, I'm on Twitter at Anima_TK. If you haven't already, hit that follow button wherever you're listening so you never miss an episode. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.